Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here talking to you about something I think probably does mean a lot to you already, and I hope at the end of today it means a lot more to you. I'm talking about something I think many of you are already dealing with in your writing, and that is the response to a work of literature that you're studying in school. Now, some of you I know are in the earlier years of developing your writing in this way, and some of you are heading towards or are already in the senior years of writing in this way. It is nevertheless something that we do in the study of literature throughout secondary school and at university. I think some of you are probably thinking, please no, I hope we're not going to talk about the essay. We are going to talk about essays, but we're going to talk about you and essays, and that's a very different matter, and that's what I want to get across today. What I'm actually going to be talking about, as you know, is the fact that we can, in fact, I'm going to assert, that's a word that you'll learn later or hear later, I'm going to assert that we can, in fact, play a part in crafting a written response where our own voice comes through, as much as telling the teacher or whoever's reading it that we do know the book we've read, we do like it, we do know the ideas, we've got things to say, but in that process, as you know yourselves, things happen, your own ideas, your own sense of being in the work can sometimes disappear. In school and in university, there are many forms of writing, traditional and non-traditional, all sorts of informal and reflective versions of writing online as well as in written form, and they can be creative. Of course, formulas are useful. Let's be honest, let's be realistic. It's handy to have a little set of rules sometimes when we start out with writing, and you probably know them already. There's an introduction, there's a body of the essay where you make some good points and you back it up, and then you finish up with a conclusion. Not very surprising at all, is it? Really. However, why is it then that we sometimes end up feeling like we have disappeared into the writing, that we're somehow not really in the writing? So the question I'm really asking you is whether you do feel like that, whether you do feel that you're disappearing into your own writing, that you're actually meeting all the requirements of the essay, and the teacher perhaps is even quite pleased to see you've actually read the book. But in the end, somehow, it doesn't sound like you. This does happen in writing, and it's something I really want to address today, and I want to try, if I can, to show you that that does not have to be so. Imagine, really, this is you. It's the last minute rush, isn't it? It's maybe midnight, the day before your essay's due, you've done all the right things, you've written about the literary text, you've even understood and enjoyed the book, but the end result, that is your essay, might as well be a council report on a blocked drain. No offence to councils, no offence to drains. I want you to take heart, because sometimes the form of writing, and when I say that I mean the essay form, the typical rules that are expected get in the way, and they govern what we do with that form of writing. And sometimes when we do that the right way, that is, we obey all those rules, it can take away from the very writing itself, and especially from what you have to say, and especially from the sense of your own voice in that process. So let's think about the essay Once Upon a Time and travel back. That's supposed to be a time machine. It's a very old-fashioned time machine. However, essays, as you probably already think or know, are old-fashioned in the sense that they go back a long time. They go back to a time where, in fact, the sense of personal voice in an essay was automatic, because it actually emerged as a personal form of writing. That might surprise many of you, especially those of you who were sitting there thinking, well, we've all got to write about the books we're reading in English. I hadn't thought of it as a personal form of writing, but it is actually, and we may as well go back and have a look at that. The personal essay, sometimes today called the personal narrative essay, so already you have a sense that an essay can be a kind of story, was originally a gift of self-expression. Writers wrote out their relationship with the world and themselves, and they enjoyed doing that. They were having, of course, a conversation in prose, we would call it. I'm talking about essayists of the 19th century, perhaps born in the 18th and writing in the 19th. People less known to you. In a minute I'll tell you who is known that knew these writers, and you'll get my drift about the kind of writerly group that formed. But some of these essayists of the 19th century you may have heard of: William Hazlitt, William Corbett, Thomas de Quincey, and my own namesake Charles Lamb. Essays, as I'm already pointing out to you, existed in many forms, and originally in this very highly personal form. As I say, writers were writing out their own view of the world. They were writing to each other in a kind of community of writers. They were hovering over a pet topic, sometimes something that really, really was annoying them, all right, or a problem that they wanted to solve in writing. Wit and fellowship was written above the door of many of these writers, and of course there was a lot of drinking as well as writing. But it was definitely, as I say, a conversation in prose, and people moving in writerly circles, and you might be surprised to know that some of these lesser-known writers were very good friends with very famous writers of the Romantic period, the poets William Wordsworth, John Keats and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Names you may know or may get to know in your study in the next few years. As I say, they like to toast fellowship and they like to get together and have conversations, but they also were having between themselves, as I keep saying, a conversation in prose. Let's think about this and have a look at an example. William Hazlitt in the 1800s, like many of the Romantic poets, would set off on a little walk of countryside that he knew well. And when he set off to the rural parts of England, which he loved and he could easily have described in some other way or made a story out of, it was the form of the essay that he chose to use to express not just what he saw, but his experience inside, his experience of nature, his relationship to solitude. And so he wrote, "One of the pleasantest things in the world is going on a journey, but I like to go by myself. I can enjoy society in a room, but out of doors nature is company enough for me. I am then never less alone than when alone." Some of you may feel like that yourselves, or at least understand that sentiment of being alone, but in some ways not feeling so alone because you're with your own thoughts and you're thinking. And in the case of William Hazlitt, you're with your own thoughts and you're thinking and you're writing too. But I hope that what you can see is that even in that very simple original paragraph from the 19th century personal essay, and very personal too, the writer does not merely assert something. He doesn't merely just tell us. He thinks about it, he problem solves it, if you like, we might say today. So he asserts and he explains, doesn't he? And then he concludes. In a way, I like to think of this as a kind of pure and delightful logic. It goes something like that, doesn't it? I like X, which is I like walking. I like society too. Why? But not as much as walking on my own. And therefore, that is what I like the best. That's what makes me happy with myself. And you'll see those scales there because a lot of writing is like that. It is about balancing. Right? It's about balancing what you want the reader to hear, as well as in your own mind thinking out loud about whether or not you want the reader to completely understand one simple thing or to complicate what the reader is imagining you mean. So I'm hoping, I suppose, in a tricky way perhaps, to suggest that this very simple personal form of the essay has elements of logic and that are true for many forms of writing, and they're true for the essays that you write too. Let's have a look at another one. Have you ever thought about the long life of work? Have you ever heard of the long life of work being described as perhaps a prison sentence, or the daily grind, or any number of those kinds of sayings? And a lot of these early writers, of course, are responsible for some of the cliches we use today. Here's an example of a very personal essay where the writer really did have a bone to pick with a particular subject. and they understood how to make the reader come along with them, even if it was, of course, in very colourful language, true, but it was still a mixture of argument, evidence and voice. Let's have a look at Charles Lamb's The Superannuated Man. Superannuation we hear about all the time, don't we? Who would have thought it went back that far? And boy, is this personal, because he had just retired from a long number of years in an office. And just like Hazlitt, he unravels, he explains, he defends and he concludes. Let's read it. If peradventure, reader, it has been thy lot to waste the golden years of thy life, thy shining youth, in the irksome confinement of an office, to have thy prison days prolonged through middle age down to decrepitude and silver hairs, without hope of release or respite, to have lived to forget that there are such things as holidays, or to remember them as the prerogatives of childhood, then, and only then, will you be able to appreciate my deliverance. It is now 36 years since I took my seat at that desk in Mincing Lane. So what he's doing, of course, is he's describing that long, dreary passage of time through his office job. But what he's doing in the writing is what concerns us. We can sympathise with it. The words are old-fashioned. These days we might call that kind of language archaic. We recognise much of the English in it, but we wouldn't say peradventure, would we? We wouldn't say that. We might not even use the word decrepitude, but we have an idea that it means old age and frailty. But what I want you to see here, as with the Hazlitt essay, is just how much Charles Lamb, even though he's very hot under the collar, very sick of what he's been through and really wants to get it off his chest, very personal essay, he establishes his situation, doesn't he? And he engages the reader's sympathy, just as William Hazlitt did. Now, these writers, as you've already heard, were very happy to use the personal pronoun I. They were very happy putting themselves at the centre of their writing, despite, and sometimes even writing about writing. But as I say, the use of the personal pronoun, while popular then and necessary and expected in a personal essay, is very contentious in other more formal and argumentative style of essays. And I bet already you're thinking, Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so said don't ever use that. And that is why I have that PowerPoint there. I know that, all right? But I think we need to relax about that, because it will never be, your essay will not stand or fall on the use of the personal pronoun I, but do, out of respect, see whether you have a teacher who prefers it or doesn't prefer it for whatever reason. And some people are offended by it. But the question of being heard in your own writing, that is, your own voice in your own writing, is not going to depend on whether you use that I or whether you don't use that I. Remember that formula still. It's that formula that counts. We'll go back to it. To assert, to explain, to conclude. It sounds boring. It sounds like just the kind of essay perhaps you're sick of or have come to be sick of. And I'm trying to undo this. It's possible to be very personal, very engaged, very excited and very interested and very interesting in your writing. You can be just as personal whether you use I or not, and your work will be the better for it. It does all seem a long time ago, the examples I've used, and quite quaint, I suppose you could say. But today writers write like this. They write long essays, they write short essays. It's really only the style of the language that's changed according to the period, naturally. Writers write essays of place, opinion essays, personal essays that actually are more like memoir, or they just kind of think on things that are bothering them, things that are interesting, just like the essayists of the 19th century. We don't have to look far. We have one right here in Sydney. What about Delia Falconer, a wonderful Sydney-based writer? What about her relatively recent book on Sydney itself? It is a long, personal essay of place. Why do I say that? Because Delia Falconer grew up in Sydney, and while she was asked to write a book about Sydney, for people who'd never been here, who knew nothing about Sydney, she couldn't help but write that long personal essay of place in a very personal way. Let's have a look at this very short opening passage from Ghosting. And here she writes, as you can see, it's from Ghosting, the first chapter. This is my favourite Sydney story. For a few decades in the middle of last century, a hospital on the North Shore sent each mother of a newborn home with a jacaranda seedling. And so when the valleys on either side of the city's train lines flare violet in October and November, each bright burst represents the beginning of a life. I was born in the old Crown Street Hospital in Surrey Hills, long since demolished, so I will not leave my own living ghost behind me, a cloud of bright mauve light. Unlike Kyoto with its cherry blossom, there is no official aesthetic tradition of jacaranda viewing here, but I cannot be the only person to divert my car up past the long run of trees on Oxford Street to enjoy the way they bloom against the colonial sandstone wall of the barracks. And so she goes on. What Delia Falconer is writing, many would regard as a personal narrative essay and as a form of creative non-fiction. It is in fact regarded as a form of creative non-fiction, that is the personal essay. They generally focused in the present, but often explore the past in order to reflect on the present, and often in a highly personal way. And there you saw it. It wasn't enough to just have a description of Sydney. It was a very particular Sydney, wasn't it? And it's a very, very strong image of a very particular place in Sydney, and a very particular place, I think, in Delia Falconer's heart. So very personal writing of an essay there. This is sometimes, naturally enough, called writing from the inside out, if you want to call it that. But one thing that's deniable, I think, about it is that writerly voice, isn't it? And also that it is a creative form. We're a long way now from just ticking boxes about introductions and bodies of paragraphs and ideas and so forth. We really are in the territory of a creative form of work. And in fact, in a traditional sense, going back to the definition of those early forms of essays, what Delia Falconer is really writing is a lyric essay. And that is the essay that looks back and delves into, thinks while it's writing, if you like. Let's look at creative non-fiction as well, in case we have some confusion about what that is. It is a fairly recent term for a body of work that includes, as I say, essays, memoirs of place, literary journalism, all sorts of things. But it's emerged in the last few years as the province of factual prose, but with a literary or stylistic or lyrical nature, not unlike poetry. We only have to think back to those purple jacarandas and the squelch of slipping on them as they rot on the pavement that Delia Falconer has embedded in our minds just a minute ago, to see that it is a lyrical and poetical form. There is a kind of fidelity, as that definition says there, to truthfulness and to factual writing, but it's a real insistence, creative non-fiction that is, on the fact that it's possible to write factual writing elegantly, artistically and compellingly. And that is where I wanted to take you, to get you to understand that it was possible to write factually about something, correctly if you like, and talk about a literary text that you're studying, as well as being engaging and creative and artistic and shaping your work. So let's think of Falconer and the lyric essay. There's a rather good description of what a lyric essay really does. Accreting, which means building up slowly in layers, and in this case in fragments, taking shape in a kind of mosaic, not necessarily A, B, C, D, E, not necessarily a linear progression of images, but the lyric essay stalks its subject like a quarry. I like that. So it doesn't let go of the thing, it keeps returning to it, and it's never content to merely explain or just say how something is. It elucidates, it makes meaning, it shows things up through the dance of its own delving. Now probably already, if you're looking at that, you're thinking, not only is that rather clever, but it's rather elegantly written too, isn't it? So there is a piece of factual writing, if you like, that is about writing, that's written elegantly and creatively. And that, of course, is possible too. So you're thinking, well, all of this is fine if you happen to be a writer or a well-known writer, and good luck to those people. But that could be you one day, and that could be you beginning now. Originality, as that saying from an Irish poet would have it, doesn't actually mean having to be different or constantly reinvent things. It can mean going back, like we have today, to an old form, a form we really know quite well now after today, and which you can shine in. Because what shines through now, even in Delia Falconer's essay we've just looked at, after all this time, is exactly the same thing, isn't it? It's that conversation in prose that the 19th century writers favoured. And the key point is still the same, isn't it? It's the engagement of the writer with their subject, the way it comes through so clearly in the writing. That strong voice. It is not, dare we say, a blocked drain, is it? If you remember that essay where you're just stuck doing all the right things, ticking those boxes. Yes, I have read the book. This is what I will say this next, etc., etc. And I suppose what I'm asking you to think about today while you're listening to this is, can you as students have a conversation in prose about literature? Can you do that, like people we've just been talking about? And I suppose what I'm asserting, to go back to that word, is yes, you can. Actually, better news even than that. It is exactly what you already are doing. Isn't that a nice thought? You were already having a conversation in prose when you're writing about works of literature. So let's have a look at formal essays and your voice. What can we do with them? There is, in fact, some requirement, as you know, for argument. So there's something there in the form of the formal essay in literature that you do have to consider, don't you? You've got other things to do. You can't just stay with your own thoughts and be elegant and poetical. You do have a job to do, the job of talking about works of literature in a fairly sort of critical or critically interested way. But still we have these things to consider, don't we? If you go back to that definition of creative nonfiction, which talked about things being research-based and factual. Also, we have the engagement of the writer with the subject, that is you, the student, with the novel you're writing about, or the poet, or the poems, or the play. And then we have voice, and then we look at the table and we see that actually these things are not very far apart at all. I hope you're already thinking back to Hazlitt and the personal essay on nature and solitude, and how that was logically developed in an emotionally persuasive way, wasn't it? It was emotionally persuasive. And arguments like that. Arguments always been like that. Since Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. We're talking here about an unusual and an old-fashioned word, really, suasory. We're talking about suasory techniques, which is persuasion and argument. And yes, you do need to do more of that in a formal literature essay, because usually you have a topic, don't you? And usually you have to agree or not agree, or discuss it, or compare, or contrast. However, it's surprisingly similar, I would suggest, to that logic of the pure and delightful logic we saw early on with William Hazlitt from the 19th century. Let's have a look what we're talking about. Hazlitt, remember, he asserts, he explains, and he concludes. Even in that tiny little passage we read, that is what he was doing. And that is what you're doing anyway, already, as I say, in essays about literature, even when you're arguing quite strongly. Another thing that might interest you is that the business in university, at least, or writing at senior level in university, of how we talk about I in that kind of work. Some researchers not that long ago got interested in this whole problem, as they saw it, of rather impersonal language creeping into students' work, because they had learnt the formula and they'd learnt it well and they were doing very well with the formula. But at some point along the way, as I've suggested, they were losing themselves in their writing. What you've got to remember, I suppose, if you want strong personal writing and you want a voice to be stronger in literature, is to remember that it is still a conversation in prose, isn't it? At the moment, there's you and the literature, and then there's the essay topic. If you like, that's all three of you, isn't it then? And you huddle together and you have thoughts in your mind and you write. But at university, what you'll find is one extra character in that conversation, and that is people who are also writing about novels and plays and poems, and you have to include them. If you think about it logically, what lies ahead of you is a real need to have a strong voice, because if you're going to hear yourself above the din of that conversation with all those people in it, then you're certainly going to need a strong voice, aren't you? You're going to need perhaps to do more of the writing of the committed I than the ego I. I think we all have a kind of suspicion of what this ego I is, you know, where you start the essay and you do want to sound a little bit impressive, and so you use longer words than maybe you're happy with, and then you pick up some other words that you've read somewhere somehow, and they're not really your words but they sound good too. And all in all, by the time you add a kind of passive voice to it, you're not sounding like anyone, but you're sounding intelligent, but you're not sounding like you. And that is the problem, isn't it? So let's go back to that pure and delightful logic. Let's see how it would work in practice if we even just wrote about something like The Great Gatsby, which, as you know, is a great film that's come out as well, the second version, or the new version, with Leonardo DiCaprio. So if we were writing about the Great Gatsby, the Scott Fitzgerald novel, how would that look, the committed I, not the ego I? And I've just tried a few little thoughts there. I think if we go back to Hazlitt's assert, explain, conclude, then we see you can write sentences that sound more like doing that, don't they? You can have, remember that table, you can have more thinking out loud about thinking words like I suspect. Sometimes it's difficult to know, or in my own view, and that's if you're using the personal pronoun I. You can explain what, you can take the trouble and the time to explain what you mean. A lot of the time we rush our writing with ticking those boxes. We don't do what 19th century essayists do, remember? They stop and they think and they delve, or even Delia Falconer now, today, 2 years ago. They stop and they delve into the delving, remember that? So you can relax, you need to relax to write like this. You need to then give your examples, don't you? The scene in Great Gatsby that means this to you or that to you. But I suppose it's going to come down to some kind of confidence in the end. But you can teach yourself confidence in a strange way by simply practicing these very simple things that put your voice first and the formulaic meeting of requirements second. And I hope in time that you will feel confident to do that. William Hazlitt himself said, "The proper force of words lies not in the words themselves, but in their application." And he was right about that. If you have to have some simple rules, they are, I suppose, to remember that conversation in prose. That is what's going to keep you engaged with an essay topic and sounding like you in your work. And try writing like that committed I, not the ego I, that committed I. And that means relaxing, as I say, and saying what you think. Remember those three simple things: assert, explain, conclude. Why not? It's good enough for William Hazlitt hundreds of years ago, good enough for us now. Keep to simple language and it will be effective because it has a precise meaning in its context. And that, perhaps more than anything, was what William Hazlitt was talking about, wasn't he? Okay, things to think about. I guess what I'm now hoping is that you do think your writing matters. It does matter. One reason it matters is that writing is an extremely satisfying way to find yourself being listened to. You know how terrible that feeling is when somehow you're not being heard and somehow your voice or what you think is not valued. And it strangely enough and ironically enough ruins a lot of writing by perfectly interesting, engaged and intelligent students who would like to have their voice heard. So that's something for you to think about. And the other thing I think for you to think about is that is how much muscle work are you prepared to do with your words? Can you already hear yourself in your writing? And if not, if you're not sure and it starts to sound like that council report about the blocked drain, is there a way you can learn to edit your writing with drafts that makes it sound more like you? Probably many people have said this to you before, but writing, what I've said today might lead you or give the impression that this is all very fresh and needs to be original and fresh and personal and you know, that's the best way to get your voice still in the writing. But in the end, you know, all writing needs to be crafted and polished, and several drafts is not unusual. You should never be content with that first draft, even two. And really that doesn't need to be drudgery if you learn to think of drafting and editing as a creative process. Just as I've suggested the essay is a personal and creative process, I would like to hope that you would think that crafting your word by changing it, even if it's a line, even if it's a paragraph, even if it's moving things around in a different order, that is actually quite a creative thing to do, especially if you're already confident that you've done that box ticking of you've talked about the novel, you've understood it, you've got good ideas, you feel quite passionate about it. All of that's come through already, and now you would like to do that glorious and beautiful thing of making the writing sound lovely, better and more like you. That's all I'm going to say today. If anyone wants to comment, they're welcome, or ask questions. I would say definitely yes, no problems at all. But in certain context, and with certain individuals, you will find that there's a nervousness about it. But it wouldn't bother me, and I think it's often very forceful if you're confident of your views. Thank you very much for listening, and I really wish you all well. And please keep thinking about writing in a way that's going to be satisfying for you. It's always better that way. Okay, bye.